30 activists with Greenpeace remain jailed in Russia and face possible piracy charges 1 week after they were detained during a peaceful protest against Arctic oil drilling. Many of the Greenpeace activists are appearing in a Russian court today. A freelance photographer and a Greenpeace spokesperson, Roman Dogov, have just been ordered to be jailed for 2 months. On September 18th, Greenpeace activists attempted to scale Russia's first Arctic offshore oil platform. A nearby Russian Coast Guard ship with agents masked on board responded. The Russians proceeded to ram and slash the Greenpeace inflatable boats, sprayed the activists with water cannons, and fired warning shots. They detained 2 Greenpeace activists who had managed to climb onto the oil platform.
A day later, armed Russian Coast Guards descended on Greenpeace's main ship, the Arctic Sunrise, using a helicopter and ropes. They reportedly lined up the majority of the 30 activists on board and held them at gunpoint on their knees on the ship's deck. Officials then towed the boat and its occupants to the port of Murmansk, where the activists were held incommunicado and questioned by investigators. Explain to us what is happening right now in the Arctic.
As we sit now, the activists are in court. Already we know that 5 activists, 2 from Russia, 1 from Canada, New Zealand and Poland, have already been sentenced to what is euphemistically called pre-trial detention, which is basically detention without trial for 2 months. And the charges that they are being investigated are actually piracy. In the words of one of the people, Denis Siniakov, a Russian colleague who is the photographer on board, he said, "The criminal activity I am blamed for is called journalism. I will continue doing it." And that captures very well what we're seeing here. This is a disproportionate use of state authority to try to silence off a very important global conversation that needs to be had. Because right now we are reaching the tipping points on climate. The Arctic serves as a refrigerator and a condition of the planet. And rather than seeing the retreating of the Arctic sea ice during the summer months as a warning sign that we have to get serious about climate change, sadly, Western oil companies like Exxon and Shell and so on are partnering with Russian state-owned companies to actually go and try to drill for the last drops of oil in this most fragile, remote and risky environment for such activities.
And talk about the Russian decision to begin exploration. How recent is it, and what are the plans in terms of how extensive they expect it to be?
The plans are pretty extensive. It is sadly a key part of the Russian government's economic strategy, actually, to harness the hydrocarbons or fossil fuels in the Arctic. Why this particular facility is important is that even though there are many explorations going on by different companies in different parts of the Arctic, this is the first actual drilling that is about to start. Well, last year when we participated in exactly the same protest, which I was part of last year, they said they were about to start then. Our protests slowed them down by about a week and then they suspended. So why this is significant is that this will be the beginning of a road to disaster if the drilling actually starts. So that's why we put so much of emphasis on this particular facility.
So Kumi Naidu, you did this last year already, you yourself. Talk about that action you did since you experienced it. I certainly remember as we were talking to you hanging off the side of the ship. And so what has happened in this year?
Well, in the course of this year, there was no charges brought against us, by the way. We were very transparent. We never hid anything. In fact, the Russian Coast Guard ship took them 3 days to get there. But once they got there, they just observed and they took a view that we were peaceful. And after we finished our protest, after about 7 days, we sailed away peacefully, no problem. So this is a completely different approach. We don't understand. I mean, piracy, by the way, is a very big international problem as we stand today. To actually bring these charges against this peaceful activists is to trivialize actually the challenge that we have on dealing with piracy, and it is to silence resistance. And the reality is, I know my colleagues who have participated in this action. In fact, a young woman called Sini Sarela, who was with us last year, was the first person to actually get arrested. And yesterday, the Russian Coast Guard themselves released footage of their reading of what they did, and it's horrific. You got Sini Sarela and another activist, Marco from Switzerland, being yanked, and while they were hanging, several meters up, and they're screaming, "We're coming down, we're coming down," and their lives were put at serious risk. And then they started shooting bullets into the water close to where the rigs were. And this is really unnecessary intimidation. We appeal to President Putin and the Russian people as a whole to understand that what is at stake here is not just the world's future, but Russia is actually very much in the firing line of climate change because of permafrost and what changes are happening, which will impact also heavily on the Russian people.
What do you make of the, on the one hand, the prosecutors saying they're going to pursue piracy, possible charges, while President Putin says, well, obviously there weren't pirates in a public forum? Is this differences within the government, or Putin just trying to put on a good face to the actions of his government?
This is a really good question to put to the Russian government, who will be the only people who could answer it with authority. The speculation is that the reading is that the occupation of the ship by the Coast Guards, when they came down by helicopters, happened in international waters, and that action by the Russian state was in fact illegal in terms of international law. And it might be that they are pursuing the piracy charges because that actually gives them cover from any litigation against them for an illegal act of occupying a ship for no good reason in international waters. That's the only speculation I've heard at the moment, but quite honestly, that's a question only the Russian authorities can answer.
And Kumi, what are the U.S. plans for drilling in the Arctic? They said they're going to release Arctic-specific drilling rules by year's end. Of course, Shell wants to drill in the Arctic.
Well, Shell has actually given the world a very eloquent example of why it is so incredibly difficult for us to even think that it's possible to safely drill in the Arctic. Shell has blown $5 billion of the investors' money over the last 2 years in one fiasco after the other, trying to get to the point of exploration. Shell has now suspended the drilling for this year to try and get the act in order. But I think that it is very misguided of President Obama and the US administration to actually allow this to actually happen. To grant any licenses is essentially yet another step towards accelerating us to irreversible climate change, because the consequences of drilling in this very fragile part of the world, which is going to be devastating.